Hey everyone, before I start, I just want to say, it still feels strange telling this story out loud, but it's one that stayed with me, and maybe it'll stay with you too. Before we begin, let me know in the comments where you're watching from, what city, what state, and if you enjoy these kinds of true, heart-touching stories, don't forget to subscribe and give this video a little like. It helps more than you know. Alright, let's get into it. That night started out just like any other Saturday at our house. My husband, Mark, had invited a few of his old friends over for dinner. The kind of gathering that's mostly laughter, the smell of grilled food, and the clinking of glasses. Our living room was warm with conversation and the low hum of the old jazz playlist Mark loves to play on evenings like that. I had worn my favorite navy blouse, the one that somehow makes me feel both confident and invisible, a balance I've gotten used to after 59 years of learning how to fade politely into the background when the men start talking shop. But then there was Ethan. He's been Mark's friend for years, someone I've known mostly through quick greetings at barbecues or brief chats when he stopped by to borrow tools. Tall, silvering hair that looked better on him than it should have, that kind of easy grin that makes you forget what you were about to say. There was always something quiet about him. The kind of quiet that wasn't shy, just thoughtful. I'd always respected that. Dinner went smoothly, laughter echoing across the dining room. I remember standing by the kitchen island, pouring coffee after dessert while everyone else debated football scores. One by one, they said their goodbyes, thanking me for the food, promising to do it again soon. By 11, the house had quieted down to just the sound of the dishwasher humming in the background. Except Ethan hadn't left. He was still sitting on the couch, swirling the last of his coffee, staring at the fireplace where the embers glowed a soft orange. I asked if he wanted a refill, mostly to break the silence. He smiled, a little tired around the edges. "No, I'm good, thanks. Just not quite ready to drive yet." I nodded. I understood that feeling too well. Sometimes silence was easier than goodbyes. I sat across from him, tucking my legs under me, the room dimly lit by the soft lamp on the corner table. The air between us was calm, comfortable. Then he asked something simple that caught me off guard. "Do you ever get tired, Linda? Not tired like sleepy, but tired of always being the one who keeps it together." I laughed quietly, not sure if he was teasing or if he'd somehow peeked straight into my chest. "Every day," I said. "It's a full-time job, pretending you're fine." He looked at me then, really looked, like he hadn't before, like maybe no one had in a while. His voice softened. "You've always seemed steady, the kind of person who doesn't let the world shake her." That made me laugh again, but this time it came out shaky. "Steady doesn't mean happy, Ethan." The conversation drifted from there, into things we never say in crowded rooms. He talked about his wife, how their silence had stretched longer than their conversations. I talked about Mark, how we'd grown into roommates who shared memories more than plans. Somewhere in the middle of it, I realized how long it had been since I'd felt seen. Not admired, not needed, just seen. The kind of seeing that doesn't demand anything back. We talked for hours. The fireplace dimmed to faint ashes, and outside, the streetlight flickered against the window pane. I could see the faint lines on his face in that half-light, stories of years, laughter, pain. When he smiled again, it was small, quiet. "You ever wonder," he said, "if maybe we all just stopped trying so hard to be who we were supposed to be, what we'd find underneath?" I didn't answer right away. I just looked at him, feeling something shift inside me. Something like recognition. "I think," I finally said, "we'd find people who are just trying to be okay." He nodded slowly. "Yeah, maybe that's enough." There was nothing else to say after that. The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was full. Like the air before a storm, not dangerous, just heavy with things we both left unsaid for years. When I finally stood up, I noticed it was nearly 2 a.m. You should probably head home, I said softly, though part of me didn't want the night to end. Yeah, he said, standing too. Thanks for talking. His eyes lingered on mine for a moment, long enough to feel it, but not long enough to break anything sacred. Then he smiled again, that same quiet smile, and left. When the door clicked shut, I stood there for a long while, listening to the hum of the refrigerator and the creak of the old house settling into sleep. Something about that night stayed in my chest. Not like guilt, not even temptation, more like awakening. It had been years since I'd felt that alive, just sitting still. I went to bed beside Mark, his soft snoring filling the room, and stared at the ceiling. My heart was calm, but my mind replayed every word, every pause, every quiet look. I didn't know what it meant then, and maybe I still don't. But something inside me had shifted, gently but undeniably, like the first crack of light after a long winter. And that's where it began, the night my husband's friend stayed after everyone left. Not with a scandal, but with something much quieter, and maybe even more dangerous. A reminder that somewhere deep inside me, there was still a woman who could feel, who could be seen, who could come alive again. I didn't see Ethan again for almost 3 weeks after that night. Life returned to its usual rhythm, or at least it looked like it did. Mornings were the same. Coffee brewing before dawn, Mark reading the paper, the television murmuring in the background with the same old headlines. But something in me had changed, and I felt it in the smallest moments. When I caught my reflection in the hallway mirror, I saw a woman who looked awake for the first time in years, and that realization both thrilled and frightened me. You know, it's strange how one simple conversation can echo in your mind louder than 1,000 ordinary days. Before I go on, if you're still with me here, tell me in the comments if you've ever had a moment that stayed with you. One you couldn't quite explain but couldn't forget either. And if you haven't subscribed yet, go ahead and do that. It means a lot to know these stories find their way to people who understand. Anyway, about 3 weeks later, Mark decided to host another get-together. It wasn't unusual. He loved having people over, filling the house with laughter and noise to avoid the quiet. I spent the afternoon cooking, roasted chicken, mashed potatoes, a salad that looked better than it tasted. Around 6, the doorbell rang, and one by one, the familiar faces came through the door. I greeted them all with smiles and polite hugs, the kind of warmth that comes from long years of habit. And then, just as I was taking the pie out of the oven, I heard his voice behind me. Need any help in here? I turned around, and there he was, Ethan. Same kind eyes, same calm presence. For a second, I forgot what I was doing and just stood there holding the hot dish with oven mitts. He smiled, and it was like the air between us folded in half, bringing that night back with a quiet rush. I think I've got it, I said, setting the pie down on the counter, though my hands felt a little unsteady. He looked around the kitchen, then leaned against the doorway. I wasn't sure if I'd see you tonight. Why's that? He shrugged lightly. Didn't know if I'd be invited again. I couldn't help but laugh, trying to brush off the weight of his words. You're Mark's friend. You're always invited. He nodded, but the look in his eyes said he knew there was more to it than that. Dinner went smoothly, just like before. The men gathered around the table talking about the same topics: politics, cars, the latest neighborhood gossip. I watched Ethan a few times when I thought no one would notice. He didn't say much. He never did. But whenever he glanced in my direction, I felt it. That quiet awareness again. After dessert, people started leaving, drifting toward the door with their jackets and goodbyes. I stacked plates in the sink, my back turned when I heard footsteps behind me. I didn't have to look to know who it was. Need a hand? He asked again. I smiled. You really like doing dishes, don't you? Not really, he said softly. Just like talking to you. For a moment, the clinking of dishes and the hum of the refrigerator filled the silence between us. Then gently he said, "I've thought about that night." I stopped rinsing the plate in my hand. "So have I." He took a slow breath. "It's strange, isn't it? How something can feel so meaningful and yet not belong to us." I turned to face him. "You're married, Ethan, and so am I." "I know." He smiled, not sadly, but knowingly. "That's why I'm saying this now, because I don't want you to think I didn't feel it too." The honesty in his voice made something inside me ache. It wasn't romantic in the usual sense. It was deeper, more human than that. It was two people realizing they'd been walking through their lives half asleep and had finally bumped into someone who noticed. I set the plate down, wiped my hands on the towel, and met his eyes. "We can't cross that line." He nodded. "I know, and I wouldn't want to hurt anyone. But maybe we don't have to forget it either." That line stayed with me. We don't have to forget it, because forgetting isn't always healing. Sometimes it's just pretending. We stood there for a while in the quiet kitchen. The light above us was soft, and the smell of dish soap mixed with lemon pie still lingered. Then, as if sensing it was time, he stepped back. "I should go before Mark comes looking for me." I managed a small smile. Good idea. When he left, I leaned against the counter, listening to the sound of his car starting outside. My heart didn't race, and there was no guilt clawing at me, just a calm, heavy awareness. Later that night, when I climbed into bed, Mark was already asleep. I lay there listening to his breathing, thinking about all the years between us, how comfort had turned into distance without us noticing. And then I thought of Ethan, of that quiet understanding that didn't need to be named. It wasn't love, not in the usual sense. It was something rarer. It was recognition. Over the next few days, I found myself thinking about my life in ways I hadn't before. The routines I'd accepted, the silence I'd settled for, the woman I used to be before time and habit softened me into someone quieter. I began taking morning walks again, something I hadn't done in years. I noticed the color of the sky, the smell of wet grass, the way the light hit the tops of the trees. I started journaling too. Not about Ethan, but about myself. What I missed. What I wanted. Sometimes we meet people who don't change our lives by staying, but by reminding us that our life is still ours to feel. And that's what Ethan had done. Not by crossing lines, not by making promises, but by waking me up to the parts of myself I'd stopped listening to. I didn't know it then, but that quiet awakening would lead to choices I never expected to make, and one evening that would change everything again. It's funny how change doesn't announce itself. It doesn't crash through your door or throw lightning across the sky. It comes quietly, in the way you start to notice the world again, the smell of your morning coffee, the way sunlight falls across the kitchen counter, the sound of your own footsteps when the house is still. Weeks passed, and life carried on, at least on the surface. Mark was busy as always, traveling for work, catching up with friends, watching his usual evening programs. We shared the same roof, the same meals, even the same bed, but I'd started to feel like a guest in my own home. It wasn't anger I felt toward him, or even resentment. It was absence, the kind that builds over years of being polite instead of honest. Before I go on, let me just say, I'm always amazed how many of you share your thoughts and stories in the comments. It feels like we're all sitting together in one big living room, just talking about life. So if you're still with me, tell me, have you ever woken up one day and realized you've been living quietly instead of fully? Let me know where you're listening from too. It warms my heart to see people from every corner of the country joining in. Anyway, one Wednesday afternoon, I stopped by the local farmer's market. I'd started going there just to get out of the house, breathe a little fresh air, maybe pick up some peaches or flowers. I was carrying a bag of apples when I heard a familiar voice. Linda? I turned around. Ethan. He looked the same, comfortable jeans, that calm half-smile. I hadn't seen him since that night in the kitchen. For a second, all the air seemed to leave the space between us. I didn't think I'd run into you here, I said, trying to sound casual. I come here every week, he replied, usually for the tomatoes. They remind me of summers when life was slower. We both laughed softly, and for a moment it was just easy. Two people standing in the middle of a market, surrounded by chatter and sunlight and the smell of ripe fruit. We walked together for a while, talking about simple things. His garden, my new obsession with baking, how time seemed to be moving faster now, and how strange that felt. And yet, underneath every word, there was that quiet understanding again. Not tension, just awareness. After a few minutes, we found a bench near the edge of the square. A light breeze moved through, rustling the trees overhead. He looked at me, not with curiosity, but with a kind of gentle recognition. You seem lighter, he said. I've been trying, I admitted, trying to remember what used to make me feel alive. I started painting again last week. He smiled. Good. You always struck me as someone who needed color. I chuckled. That's a poetic way to say I've been dull. He shook his head. No, just waiting to remember who you were. His words sat between us for a moment, and I realized how right he was. I'd been waiting. For what? I didn't know. Permission, maybe. Or courage. We talked for nearly an hour. About our marriages, our fears, how time sneaks up on you. There was no flirtation, no hidden intention. It was two people connecting in the most human way possible, through honesty. Before he left, he said something I'll never forget. You know, sometimes we don't meet people to stay in our lives. We meet them to remind us what being alive feels like. Don't lose that. And then he was gone, just like that. No promise to call, no awkward goodbye. He walked away into the sunlight, and I sat there for a long time, letting the words sink in. When I got home, the house felt different. Not emptier, just quieter in a new way. I went upstairs, opened the window, and looked out at the garden. The roses had started to bloom again. They'd been dormant for years, but this spring, they were alive with color. That night, I told Mark I wanted to take a weekend trip, alone. He looked surprised, but didn't question it. You sure you'll be okay? He asked. I think that's the point, I said with a small smile. The following weekend, I drove up to the coast. The ocean has always been my place of reflection. I walked along the beach, the sand cold under my feet, and thought about everything that had led me here. The quiet years, the routines, the small awakenings. I realized that what Ethan had given me wasn't temptation or confusion. It was a mirror. He'd held it up without judgment, and for the first time in a long while, I'd looked at myself honestly. I spent that weekend journaling, painting, sitting by the window with coffee and watching the waves. And somewhere between sunrise and sunset, I began to understand something that had taken me decades to learn. Feeling alive doesn't always mean starting over. Sometimes it means seeing what you already have with new eyes. When I returned home, Mark greeted me with his usual warmth. He asked about my trip, and I told him it was peaceful. That night, as we sat together watching TV, I reached over and held his hand. It surprised him, I could tell, but he smiled just a little. We didn't talk about it, and we didn't need to. Something had shifted, not because of guilt or longing, but because I had finally remembered how to feel present again. That's what awakening really is, I think. Not a grand event, not a wild change, just a quiet return to yourself. And though Ethan faded back into his own life, what he left behind stayed with me. The courage to stop living quietly, the permission to feel again, the reminder that at 59, life still has room to bloom. I didn't know it then, But that realization would lead to the hardest conversation of my marriage, and the most honest one we'd ever have. The conversation I'd been avoiding finally came one Sunday afternoon. The house was unusually quiet. Even the clock seemed to tick slower. I'd spent the morning cleaning the kitchen, rearranging drawers, anything to keep from sitting still. But sometimes silence finds you no matter how busy you pretend to be. If you've been following this story so far, you probably know what's coming, the moment when truth no longer waits. Before I tell you what happened next, I just want to say thank you for staying with me through this. It means something to share a story that isn't about drama or scandal, but about real life, the kind that sneaks up on you, the kind that asks you to grow. So, if this story speaks to you, let me know in the comments where you're listening from, and if you haven't already, please subscribe and like this video. It helps keep these stories alive, and maybe it'll help someone else find their own moment of clarity. That afternoon, Mark walked into the kitchen, still in his slippers, a cup of coffee in his hand. He sat down at the table, the same table we'd shared meals at for more than 30 years. I looked at him, really looked, the way I used to when we were young. His hair had thinned, his shoulders stooped a bit, but his eyes, those same warm brown eyes, still held the quiet steadiness that had made me fall for him in the first place. He must have felt something in the air because he set down his coffee and asked, "What's on your mind, Linda?" For a moment, I wanted to retreat, to hide behind small talk. But instead, I took a breath and said, "I've been thinking about us." His eyebrows lifted just slightly. "Us?" "Yes, about how we've been living. How we talk or don't. How it feels like we've been side by side, but not together." He didn't interrupt. He just listened. I went on, my voice trembling a little. "I think somewhere along the way, we stopped being curious about each other. We learned to coexist instead of connect. And I miss you, Mark. I miss the way we used to talk. I miss being seen." He was quiet for a long moment. I could see him turning over his thoughts the way he always did when something hit close to home. Then softly he said, "I guess I thought you were content. You never said otherwise." I didn't know how to. I admitted. It's easier to be quiet than to risk being misunderstood. He looked down at his hands, then back up at me. "You're right. I've been absent in my own way too. Maybe I thought growing older meant settling down, not realizing I'd started settling in." The honesty in his voice caught me off guard. I'd prepared myself for defensiveness or distance, but instead there was something open, vulnerable. I reached across the table and touched his hand. It was a small gesture, but it felt like the start of something. "I don't want to give up on what we've built," I said. "I just want it to mean something again." He nodded slowly. "Then maybe we start over. Not as who we were, but as who we are now." It wasn't a grand declaration. It wasn't cinematic. It was quiet, imperfect, real. And for the first time in a long time, I felt hope. That night, after dinner, we went for a walk. The air was cool, the kind of early spring evening where you can still see your breath. We didn't talk much at first, just walked side by side, the way we had when we were young and broke and dreaming of futures we didn't yet understand. At one point, he stopped and said, "You know, I was scared to ask if you were unhappy. I didn't want to hear the answer." I smiled sadly. Maybe we both stopped asking questions because we were afraid of the answers. We kept walking, the sound of gravel under our shoes filling the silence. When we reached the park, the streetlights had started to come on, casting long golden paths across the grass. I felt a sudden calm, a knowing that this was what rebuilding looked like. Not grand gestures, but showing up. When we got home, I wrote in my journal again. I wrote about honesty, about small beginnings, about how sometimes the hardest thing is not leaving, but staying and doing the work. And I wrote about Ethan, not as a secret, but as a lesson. He had been a spark, nothing more. nothing less. A reminder that I was still capable of feeling, still capable of changing. I didn't owe him closure because what he gave me wasn't something to end. It was something to carry forward. A few weeks later, I found an old photo of Mark and me from our first trip together. We were sitting on a beach, laughing at something I can't even remember now. I framed it and put it on the mantel. When Mark noticed it, he smiled. "That was a good day," he said. "It was," I replied. "Maybe we can make more like it." And slowly we did. We started cooking dinner together again. We took small trips, had longer conversations. It wasn't perfect. It never is. But it was real. I began to understand that love at this age isn't about excitement or novelty. It's about the courage to see someone fully again, even after years of silence. Looking back now, I realize that life doesn't always give us dramatic turning points. Sometimes it gives us gentle reminders, a conversation, a look, a feeling that guide us back to ourselves. So when I think of that night when my husband's friend stayed after everyone left, I don't think of it as the night that changed everything. I think of it as the night that woke me up. The night I remembered that I was still here, still capable of growth, of joy, of rediscovery. And if you take anything from my story, let it be this. It's never too late to begin again. Whether you're 59 or 89, there's always something new to learn about yourself and about love. Thank you for listening. Tell me in the comments what part of this story spoke to you most and where you're joining from. And if it touched you, even just a little, subscribe and stay with me for more stories like this. Because sometimes sharing our small awakenings can help someone else find their own.